We have two panels left, and the next panel is one that we could not properly not do given the fact that we are in Munich. So this one is titled In Conversation with Helsing, Precision Mass for a Stronger Europe. To the stage, we have Ned Baker, the Managing Director for the United Kingdom and Ukraine for Helsing, and Dr. Tobias Stone with Resilience Media. Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, hi, Ned. Managing Director of UK and Ukraine. Tell us what Helsing's been doing in Ukraine.
Sure. So, well, let me start a little bit just telling you what Helsing is first.
Yeah, what is Helsing?
Yeah, let me start there, and then we'll talk about Ukraine. So, Helsing, we're a European defence tech company. We are still relatively young, established in 2021. But we've grown very, very quickly thanks to some very generous VC funding, and that's meant that we've been able to establish our presence across Europe. We have establishments in Munich, in Berlin, in Paris, in London, recently opened up in Estonia, and we've been active in Ukraine since shortly after the large-scale invasion. So what do we do? Well, Helsing was founded basically on two beliefs. One was a mission-focused belief, and the other was a technology-focused belief. The mission-focused belief is that that Europe needs effectively a new breed of defence company, a stronger defence industry, and a defence industry that is able to grapple with the newest technologies and implement them into our systems. Which leads us on to the technology front. The belief on technology front is that defence, like a lot of other industries, is becoming software-defined. That is to say, the most important characteristic of future defence platforms or future defence assets will not be its hardware or its armaments or its armour, it will be the software that it runs. So what are we doing in Ukraine? I mean, Ukraine has started out as, I guess, emblematic of our mission, i.e. we wanted to use technology to serve democracies, to help democracies, to enable them to protect themselves. And so shortly after the large-scale invasion, we made an offer of help. We said, this is us, this is our companies, our capabilities, what can we do to help you? And ever since then, it's become really central to a lot that Helsing does, especially when we work in the land domain. So Helsing works multi-domain, but when we're focusing on the land domain, almost every product that we produce or we design or we work with has become at the very least inspired by what we see in Ukraine, but most of the time actually deployed and iterated in Ukraine. If it doesn't work in Ukraine, then it's probably not going to work anywhere else when the time comes.
Yeah, and can you give an example of something that's had that genesis?
Sure. So we actually had some news out today. We are deploying an additional 6,000 Helsing strike drones to Ukraine this year. The Helsing strike drone that we currently deploy was designed in concert with Ukrainian end users, with Ukrainian industry, and specifically to service the Ukrainian needs. And that is an AI-enabled strike drone able to operate at a certain range and, crucially, able to overcome electronic warfare countermeasures by the Russians.
So have you been building the drone infrastructure, the physical drone, as well as the software?
We do now. We made a decision last year that although we were a software-focused company and we remain a software-focused company, we wanted to take more responsibility over the vertical integration of that software onto hardware.
And this ties into something I hear a lot in my work, that if you're building things like drones or drone software, if you're not in Ukraine, you're really not succeeding. That connection right down to the front line, can you give an idea of the speed and the pace and the importance of your presence on the ground to how you build things?
I think it's what gives us our competitive edge. So by being in Ukraine and by having our engineers deployed with frontline units quite a lot of the time, seeing what's happening, testing products, iterating, improving, it changes everything. It changes how you think about the systems design, it changes about how you think about production, and it's enabled basically by software, because the hardware iterations, although they do need to happen, cannot happen at the same speed that software iterations can. And actually, I think that's one of the key lessons that we need to bring back from Ukraine and embed in our own work with European armed forces.
Yeah, and we're talking about manufacturing today, and most of it's been about hardware, which is a slower cycle. But one of the things we hear a lot in Ukraine is that something will be deployed and then the software will be updated the next day to respond to feedback. Have you been in that sort of really fast cycle? Can you give some examples?
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, in effect, both the software and the hardware needs to iterate, and you'll hear so many different kind of quoted timelines about, oh, it needs to iterate every day, it needs to iterate every week, it needs to iterate every 2 weeks. From working in Ukraine for the last 2 years, I don't think there is a clear metric. I think it just needs to iterate fast, basically, and faster than the adversary. You need to get inside the adversary's OODA loop. It all depends on the sector in which you're operating. It all depends on your adversary's force, how quickly they can implement countermeasures. So I think the simple thing to take away is iteration, adaptation at speed is key to future survival.
And do you think, I mean, obviously the face of this conflict is changing as of yesterday. If the conflict slows down or gets frozen, will that need for speed move into a new phase of something different?
It's really hard to say, and I don't want to, crystal ball gaze, because nobody knows which way the conflict will go. I think what the conflict has proven is that speed and adaptation iteration is key, and therefore you need to have the ability to do it. So your adversary, whether it's Russia looking on into Ukraine or whether it's Russia looking on into Estonia, will basically judge an adversary's capabilities, not necessarily just by what they can see, but what's behind it. So not just how many tanks can I count on the front line, but what is the nation-state's capability to adapt and overcome and counteract to whatever action I take. That will be the key to deterrence.
So it's interesting. Our previous panel was about defence manufacturing capacity being a deterrence. Yep. But actually what you're saying is also we need to demonstrate an ability to adapt software very fast, even if the war slows down now.
It's definitely both. And I think General Vaughan said something that really resonated with me. He said that he receives a lot of pitches from different startups, and he thinks it's a great idea, but what's your plan to scale? Actually, this is a really, really key point. So you've absolutely got to have innovation, but then you've got to have industrialization. So we talk about this concept called precision mass, and what we mean by that is that we see great value in having large numbers of relatively cheap, individual units of small platforms. And those can be drones, they could be underwater gliders, they could be all sorts of different things enabled by software, made intelligent by software, but deployed en masse. So you're able to cover more ground, more territory, get more sensor data, and use the AI and the software in order to automate whatever you need to automate. So you can have, one human controlling 1,000 drones, for example.
Yeah, and another thing that came out of today's discussions was around a more coherent ecosystem, partnerships. How are you working? Because I know you do a lot of partnerships with other companies. How are you working to sort of build an ecosystem around yourselves?
So partnerships is super important to us. They are really important to us because we are a software company and software needs to run on hardware. And also a point that the last panel made really well was that legacy systems are here to stay. No European armed force can afford to replace their entirety of their legacy systems in one fell swoop. So 80% or 90% or whatever arbitrary figure you want to take of systems that we have today are probably what we're going to be fighting wars with tomorrow over the next decade. Software can have quite a profound and radical effect on actually upgrading those legacy systems, making them more effective, more resilient, more lethal, and so that takes partnership. A great example of the partnership that we're working on at the moment is with Saab. We work with Saab to upgrade Germany's Eurofighter fleet with cognitive EW systems. So there's a great example of a relatively new incumbent like Helsing working with very established defence primes.
And is that possible because you have a lot of finance behind you, or do you think smaller companies can do that as well? Is it slow and expensive, or?
It's expensive if you want to do it fast
Yeah.
and well. And it's expensive because you need to afford, compute, yes, all that sort of stuff, but frankly, great talent. And great talent is in short supply, and so therefore it's expensive. I think the other thing I say is that the difference between us as a startup compared to a prime is that given we have that VC backing, that VC funding, we can invest in a huge amount of our own R&D. So we can develop products up to a certain TRL level, taking our own risk, and then present that either to an end customer, government customer, or to a prime and say, look, we've de-risked your program, look how far we've come, now let's move to the next stage.
So do you think that approach to risk is really what distinguishes you and others like you from the primes, that you have a different take on risk? You take risk in advance?
I think it's a major factor. I mean, if you're talking about companies like Anduril or Palantir, take a very similar approach, and that does de-risk programs. There's other characteristics that are very similar. I mean, a similar approach to wanting to take inject more urgency into the defence system, to not want to trying to not use the word disrupt because it's such an overused term, but basically to try something quite radically new, something that you're committed to and you believe in, and then taking the risk yourself to do it.
And do you think that you need venture funding in order to take those radical risks? Is it distinct to venture fund-backed companies?
No, not always. But it does help.
It does help, because that's the attitude of venture funding. So we were talking earlier about how all of this is paid for.
Yep.
Venture capital is a drop in the ocean compared to our total defence spend.
Yep.
And we were looking at other forms of funding and debt and family office funding. But if you didn't have venture funding, if you had something more conventional, do you think it would be harder for you to take those risks and move that quickly?
I think what venture capitalist funding gives us is a confidence and ambition and urgency to get on with it now. So we can do it in a hurry, and we can do it at the pace and at the speed that frankly is needed. I think that it's perhaps not recognised in European MODs basically what a gift this is to them, that somebody else is investing their money to take R&D to a pace where they would just about any traditional prime just wouldn't, to invest in new products. And I think they really need to realise this is a great moment for them to capitalise on, to de-risk what they want to achieve.
So how is it when companies like Helsing try to work with established primes? Is there a culture clash, or does it work?
It's case by case, project by project. Would I say there's a culture clash? No, I think there's some absolutely fantastic primes out there doing amazing work, doing incredibly cutting-edge work. I think it's about finding the complementarity between what companies like Helsing offers and what the primes offers. I don't think I think partnership is super important. I think Helsing is going to change as a company. I think the primes are going to change as companies, and we just need to find new ways to work together, because ultimately we're not really competing. Okay, we might compete with each other for projects and outcomes, but ultimately we're all trying to do the same thing, which is protect our countries.
And you walked into the next question, which is, what does Helsing look like in 5 years' time?
That's a big question, and I'm only a managing director, not a founder, so that I would have to... what does Helsing look like? Helsing looks like... Helsing looks like a company that has effectively managed to deploy capability. Multi-domain is key. Multinationally is key. And deliver capability that is both interoperable, so we can deploy strike drones in the UK or cognitive EW capabilities in Germany and work across nations, but crucially has offered those nations sovereignty. So we have managed to give individual nations capability that they can be wholly reliant on themselves and not reliant on anyone else.
So people like Kaya Kallas have been talking about the need for a more unified defence market and defence industry. Do you think it will fall to these sort of very fast-moving, independent, privately backed companies to go and create that mass integration and connectivity that perhaps more state-led initiatives won't do?
I think it is either up to them, or it's at least up to them to provide the proof points and the catalyst to enable it to happen. Europe has this massively fragmented defence market, and I think that companies like Helsing, and there's lots of others, can prove that this is an actually a beneficial operating model and a profitable operating model.
That's great. And what are your thoughts on the manufacturing base? Are you bringing your software into manufacturing at all, or are you still focused on other things?
So as I say, we've taken on more responsibility about the vertical integration of our software into certain bits of hardware. That hardware, I think you'll see more of it. We will continue to do that when it comes to hardware that, like I say, could be described as precision mass. Helsing is not going to be designing the next, fighter jet or tank or submarine. There are amazing primes that are incredibly well equipped to do that. But we are, a software prime. And there is a future at some point, maybe not 5 years, but maybe 10 years or 15 years, where you will have a software prime priming a major hardware acquisition program, like for a fighter jet or a submarine or a frigate.
Do you think there'll be a time where software can be moved in and out? So you might have a Helsing software product on a battleship and then switch it out for something else in the future?
I think so. I think that's actually an incredibly important point. So one of the things that a lot of our MODs and armed forces are really worried about is that kind of vendor lock-in. So buying one software platform and then being stuck with it forever. I don't think that's the way forward. I think it is as much as possible being able to offer a software platform that is interoperable, that others can bring the kind of the best-in-class AI models or whatever it is, plug into it, and ultimately give the best capability. I don't think we want to go down the kind of vendor lock-in model. We're also really intent that the customer, the end user, the MODs or the armed forces continue to own their own data. I think that's a really important point around sovereignty as well.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you.